I have good reason to believe that many individuals, Max Williams, Investigator Winters, HPD Detective Lauren Tucker, HPD Supervisor Jose, HPD Blonde Female Sanchez, Assistant District Attorney Michael Abner, ADA Nevin Day, Prosecutor Kaylee Veltri, and unidentified person of interest Brittany E. Garrett, between 4/22/2024 till this date, have engaged in several potential acts of evidence tampering, fabrication, or falsification. Additionally, there have been possibly multiple procedural misconducts, including violations of due process and policies, inappropriate use of force, misuse of legal authority, failure to investigate, lack of transparency and accountability, selective enforcement, prosecutorial misconduct, retaliation, witness intimidation, and several deliberate discrepancies in legal documentation by using their authority to subvert the system and due process in order to pursue their own self-interest to a gross degree. I have good reason to believe that many individuals staffed by the Harris County District Attorney's Office and HPD SVU have engaged in several potential acts of evidence tampering, multiple procedural misconducts, including violations of due process and policies, inappropriate use of force, misuse of legal authority, failure to investigate, lack of transparency and accountability, selective enforcement, prosecutorial misconduct, retaliation, witness intimidation, improper use of resources, obstruction of justice, interference, and several deliberate discrepancies in legal documentation pointing to potential judicial misconduct that warrant a full investigation. After I brought these issues, initially perceived as errors, to the attention of the Professional Integrity Office, and then to the district attorney staff, I faced threats of trespass by Detective Winters and was accosted and harassed, and also threatened with trespass by a specific employee named Max Williams, who should have little involvement in my concerns. This employee has strongly implied that he will use physical force against me if he sees me, even in the public areas of the district attorney's office. These set of events and further set of events stemmed from when my employee and my tenant, the defendant, was arrested in a SWAT team-like raid on his domicile on May 22, 2024, which is unusual for a parole revocation warrant. According to the district clerk's website, it appears the authorities did not have a warrant signed by a judge and perhaps opted to use this parole revocation warrant instead. I cannot find any evidence that using such a show of force and resources is appropriate in the execution of this kind of warrant. The defendant is an elderly man of 65 years who could easily have not heard a command and potentially been injured or killed for not complying. There was no necessity to use such force against an elderly man who has had no parole violations for 9 years and no dirty urine tests. The defendant was arrested on May 22nd at 11:40 p.m. and booked on May 23rd around 12:30 a.m., just after midnight. I have photos of the officers holding him at gunpoint with several rifles and pistols, all for a parole violation. However, clerk's records indicate that he was rearrested around 9 a.m. for aggravated sexual assault of a victim 65 or older, which appears to be the true reason for his arrest. It seems evident that the parole warrant was just a pretext for this arrest. I further discovered that the charges for aggravated sexual assault were issued against him on May 3rd. Despite this, a judge did not grant or sign a warrant for his arrest. However, on April 23rd, they allegedly obtained a parole revocation warrant. This means they allowed him to roam free for almost a month before using an incredible amount of force during his arrest. These two actions are contradictory, raising several implications of whether the execution of the warrant was legal and justified. Why was he not arrested promptly upon its issuance? This charge stems from an incident that allegedly occurred on August 25th, 2021, where a woman claimed a stranger with red hair, not fitting the defendant's description, committed anal rape against her on a street named Pilot in a shed whose location she cannot remember. This is critical information, as there are 2 Pilot streets 8 miles apart in different area codes, and this accounts for virtually 50% of the probable cause against the defendant, as his Texas ID is registered to one of the Pilot streets. Allegedly, there were no witnesses, and she allowed another unknown man to take her to the hospital after the attack, which is inconsistent with the behavior of a victim of a traumatic assault. She did not call the police nor an ambulance, had no injuries in the perineal area, only the hymen, and stated she was not sexually active. Detective Lauren Tucker swears she got a CODIS high-stringency partial match back from DPS on February 15, 2022, along with the defendant's ID number and address matching Pilot Saint. I see no reasonable explanation for, after a DNA match, Detective Tucker would not immediately move to arrest the perpetrator, but instead she delayed justice by waiting 797 days to take action, which would be a great injustice for the victim of a sexual assault. Therefore, she was not concerned with seeking justice, or it was not a high priority, but her sworn statements must be called into question regardless. After Detective Lauren Tucker did not disclose her employment history with the Board of Pardons and Paroles, and then deleted the online evidence after I brought it to the attention of DA staff and her alleged supervisor, Jose, which is akin to evidence tampering, clearly, Detective Tucker's sworn statements are open to scrutiny after these actions. And in consideration to the possibility that she could have the ability to access the CODIS records and addresses of parolees, considering her employment history with the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And the defendant was not directly informed of the alleged DNA match information as it was not included in the refiled complaint signed by an affiant named Brittany E. Garrett. I cannot even identify them other than possibly as a log manager for the clerk's office, which would make it completely inappropriate for them to sign a sworn affidavit on a case they have no firsthand knowledge of. Every district attorney staff member I can easily identify electronically, but this person I cannot, and any queries I make on the identity of this person yield nothing but denial, deflection, and strange answers by DA staff and HPD staff. Also, when I presented digital evidence showing the woman was known to me and the defendant by timestamp text messages from years ago, the evidence was disregarded and dismissed. A clear violation according to the court ruling of Brady v. Maryland. Clearly, several issues are evident here. This case has no business being prosecuted, nor the individual being detained indefinitely, and is a waste of resources. Additionally, an ADA named Nevin Day requested a subpoena for the woman's hospital records, even though there was alleged DNA evidence that matched with CODIS, supposedly pointing to the defendant with high accuracy. The subpoena, issued by Nevin Day, did not redact the victim's name, which is highly improper. This either demonstrates incompetence, a lack of care for professional responsibilities, or great haste, and is clearly a breach of confidentiality, violation of privacy, violation of legal protections, or negligence. Also, on May 23rd, the same day the defendant was booked into jail, another man with a pre-revocation warrant and charges for failure to identify himself to a peace officer had his charges dismissed for the third time in a row. This individual had been arrested several times over the past years for the same violation, and each time he was released, despite a history of similar offenses in 2005 for which he was convicted. The authorities cited insufficient evidence each time, which is puzzling and a stark contrast to the defendant's treatment under the same parole hold and serves to be, at minimum, evidence of some biases or ulterior motives by the same individuals handling the case files of the defendant. This man, by sheer happenstance, was traced back to possibly be an acquaintance of the defendant from 40 years ago, connected to a serious criminal case in which the defendant played a key role in securing the prosecution and conviction of capital murder for the principal offender. The released individual was associated with the convicted offender as a witness he called upon and seems to be receiving unusually favorable treatment despite his extensive criminal history. He was even offered bond, which is unusual given his parole hold, and his bond was reduced from $5,000 to $50, an unprecedented action, all while Michael Abner is also handling his case documents. The defendant, in contrast, initially received a $100,000 bond due to his criminal history and is now held without bond. The same district attorneys, Michael Abner and Nevin Day, were involved in handling both cases. The fact that this other man, with a longer criminal history, received such lenient treatment raises serious concerns about the motivations and actions of the district attorney's office. I believe that Michael Abner and Nevin Day could have some unknown ulterior motives. Regardless if these cases are not related, they both involve two males of similar age, one receiving lenient treatment despite his more extensive criminal history, extensive parole violations, and being a fugitive from justice. And in contrast, the defendant is experiencing the opposite while he was not a fugitive from justice and was in compliance with his parole for 9 years and clearly has a support network. Additionally, when I read the defendant a list of witnesses called by the principal offender in the capital case, he recognized one of them as a former cellmate in prison. This is incredibly concerning because this man, Kenneth Island, was known to be an associate of the principal offender. The defendant was put in protective custody precisely because he was in danger of retaliation for his involvement in the conviction. Somehow, the authorities allowed this associate to be his cellmate. Both the defendant and the other man are having their paperwork handled by Michael Abner. According to the district attorney's office, he is responsible for intake, and from my research, he should not be handling a case regarding an SVU investigation. This raises further concerns about the motivations and actions of the district attorney's office. I must also reiterate that Detective Tucker was a parole officer for 4 years, which violates ethical and moral standards by the district attorney's office. She should have recused herself from the investigation once she learned it involved a parolee. She claimed she learned the defendant's identity on February 15, 2022, yet she did not recuse herself or file charges until May 3, 2024, about 800 days later. This delay is inexplicable and warrants investigation. Furthermore, Detective Tucker was a parole officer until 2017, and the defendant has been on parole since 2015, meaning she could have been in the same office. This makes her involvement in the investigation even more highly inappropriate. She swears in her affidavit that she was alerted by DPS of the CODIS sample number and match, but it is reasonable to believe she could easily have accessed his CODIS sample information using a contact within the parole office. When I disclosed this conflict of interest to Lauren's supervisor, Jose, he did not agree that it was inappropriate or that it was evidence of anything. He refused to let me hand him the documents that had my concerns and some evidence bullet-pointed and said Lauren would contact me soon. When I asked about Brittany E. Garrett, he immediately retorted, "I don't know who that is." A woman named Sanchez was present as a witness during this encounter. A few days after this, Detective Tucker deleted her LinkedIn profile where I found this information. Fortunately, I made a copy of the webpage as evidence before it was deleted. Coincidentally, the defendant had another friend in jail who allegedly sustained serious injuries and was denied medical care for several days. She was sedated by the sheriff's office in jail and charged with assaulting an officer by allegedly twisting his arm. Given the circumstances, it seems highly unlikely that she could have injured a male officer, especially since she had experienced a break or fracture before or during the arrest, as she was allegedly attacked by a store owner with a cane. This woman was allegedly sedated for several days and only received medical care afterward. She was eventually forced to take a plea deal when the defendant was no longer able to aid her. 2 months before the defendant's arrest, he had been answering her calls and sending funds to help her while she was in jail. He was also assisting her in seeking legal help for her case and personal injuries. Because the defendant's communications were registered with Securus, the company handling phone calls in jail which are monitored and recorded, it's possible that the authorities honed in on his voice recordings. It is possible they may have seen that he was providing her with legal help, and also possible that they retaliated by pushing the sexual assault case they had not pursued earlier because of its insufficiency and the credibility of the victim, who has an extensive criminal history, which effectively stopped him from assisting her. This would align with Nevin Day seemingly frantically filing the unredacted subpoena to begin the process of forming a case after the fact, as I have no reason to believe DNA evidence is present if it was not included in the current complaint. Furthermore, when I brought these concerns to the attention of the District Attorney's Office, they dismissed my concerns and made inappropriate comments, suggesting that I was obstructing justice or subverting the process. In reality, I was trying to ensure that justice was administered fairly and correctly as dictated by the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. I provided multiple individuals with copies of the evidence I had, including my statements, material fact evidence, and details that contradicted the allegations, such as the woman's identity and electronic evidence of me mentioning her name in text messages with the defendant in 2021. Yet, the evidence was not introduced as far as I can ascertain. I vividly remember the events of the day in question, August 25th, particularly because there was an increased police presence on Pillett Street due to a dispute I had with the city over parking ordinances. Many family members and I were at home most of the day, and we would have known if the defendant had done anything wrong. Based on this, I have no reason to believe he committed the alleged acts, not to mention the exculpatory evidence I've provided as a material fact witness. I hold firsthand knowledge that no one else could. There is not a better witness possible in a case like this, so it is a travesty to disregard my statements and material fact evidence I provided. Despite providing this evidence to the District Attorney's Office, they did not submit it to the clerk or take any discernible action. As a last resort, I emailed the clerk directly with the evidence, requesting that it be considered by the judge. Surprisingly, they accepted my email and included the evidence in the file. This suggests that other employees of the office may have destroyed, hidden, or suppressed the evidence I provided to them both physically and electronically, which is a clear affront to Brady vs. Maryland. It was the District Attorney's Office's duty to present the evidence set forth. Now, I will provide my recollection of the events that took place during my physical visits to 1201 Franklin and one instance at 1200 Travis.